My name is Amy Henderson, and you're listening to the In the World podcast, where we use a Christian lens to analyze entertainment and media. Today, we're in the world of The Village, the 2004 Touchstone thriller from director M. Night Shyamalan. Now, the movie's been out for about 16 years, so I really shouldn't need to include a spoiler warning, but hey, I watched a video about Mr. Rogers this morning, so I'm feeling neighborly. I will be completely spoiling the surprise ending of this movie. So if you haven't seen it yet and want to enjoy the big reveal at any future date, I recommend pressing pause and watching the movie before you come back. If you haven't seen the movie because thrillers ain't your thing, no worries. You can enjoy today's conversation anyway. Speaking of which, we're going to start with something simple: faith and fear. With a little interpretive discretion and without being too critical, we're going to do a close reading comparison between the character Ivy Walker in The Village and the Apostle Simon Peter from the New Testament through specific experiences in their respective stories of faith and fear. And driving this slightly radical comparison will be the following question: what is the relationship between fear and faith? First, we're going to make sure we understand what these two stories have in common. Let's start with The Village. For those of you who haven't seen the movie or who may have forgotten some of the key plot points, I'll give you the highlight reel. The story features the character Ivy Walker, a girl who's blind living in the 1830s-style village of Covington, a village completely surrounded by creepy woods that are home to moderately intelligent monsters. The arrangement is simple. The people of the village stay out of the woods, and the monsters leave them alone. Romantic subplot: Ivy is in love with Lucius. Shortly after Ivy and Lucius announce their engagement, Lucius is stabbed by Noah, a young man with a mental disability, and he needs medicine that Covington doesn't have. With permission from her father, Ivy goes into the woods to find the towns that will have medicine that can save Lucius. But before she leaves, her father shares with her the first big twist of the movie.
The monsters are a farce, made up and kept up by the elders to keep everyone in the village safe from the outside dangers of the world.
Despite her father's confession that the monsters aren't real, Ivy is stalked by one of the monsters on her journey and ends up mortally wounding it. However, this turns out to be Noah in a monster costume, but Ivy, being blind, doesn't know that. In an even bigger twist than the first, Ivy arrives at the towns, only for the audience to discover that it isn't the 1830s. It's the 2000s, and the village of Covington exists in a secret land preserve owned by her wealthy father, Edward Walker. But because Ivy doesn't see any of that, she returns to Covington just as ignorant of the outside world as when she left. Based on the ending, it is assumed that the village continues living as they have in secret. Great story. Gave me nightmares the first time I saw it. I've got this weird thing with monsters. It takes me a bit to warm up to them, but if you like thriller movies, it's worth watching. Even spoiled. Now, let's talk about Simon Peter. For the purpose of today's discussion, we're going to focus on the story in Matthew 14, where Simon walks on the water towards Jesus and sinks. Starting in verse 27, Jesus appears on the water and says, "Be not afraid." Peter then comes down out of the ship and walks towards Jesus. Verse 30 says that he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried, saying, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reaches out his hand to save Peter, and then in verse 31, he provides a firm but compassionate rebuke. "O thou of little faith, wherefore didst thou doubt?" So, what do these two stories have in common? Well, not much, unless you're really looking. So, let's really look. The New Testament story of Peter is one of the quintessential stories about faith and fear. Boiled down, the story shows how fear destroys our faith. Peter saw the water around him and the wind blowing, he became afraid, and started to sink. This fits well with the widely accepted idea that fear is the opposite of faith. But there's an important word choice in the story that suggests an alternative opposite to faith. Jesus rebukes Peter and asks, "Wherefore didst thou doubt?" Pause there. Let's look at our scene from The Village, specifically the scene where Ivy encounters the monsters in the woods after she's been told the monsters aren't real. This scene is actually quite similar to the story of Peter walking on the water. Ivy is a faithful person in general. I could write an essay about that. In fact, I have written an essay about that. The first draft of this episode was a detailed analysis of Ivy's faith in the movie. There's a lot to unpack, but to summarize those findings, I'll narrow down the strength of her faith to a few main components. First, she does her absolute best with the knowledge she has. From a dramatic irony perspective as an audience member, we know a lot of things she doesn't know, but based on her current knowledge, she has amazing faith. Our faith is always measured by our current circumstances, not future ones. Second, she acts on her faith. She proves it. In one very powerful scene in the film, the monsters have come to the village, and everyone starts running into their homes and locking the doors to keep the monsters out. Ivy helps her family inside, and then stands by the open door, with her hand outstretched, waiting for Lucius. Despite not having shared their feelings for each other yet, Ivy knows that Lucius cares about her family, and her, and she has faith that he will come to keep them safe. Enough faith to keep her waiting on the doorstep, with her hand outstretched, as a monster is seen approaching from the background, gradually coming into focus as it gets closer and closer and closer. Just before it reaches her, Lucius takes her hand and shuts the door behind them. No passive beliefs for her, only courageous actions for Ivy. Third, Ivy's faith is flexible. She asks questions and learns new things, but she always retains her faith. When she finds out that much of what she learned growing up was a lie, what did she do? Did she start doubting and get angry and turn away from her family and throw a temper tantrum? No, this wasn't a spin-off of Days of Our Lives. Granted, sometimes receiving more knowledge can be difficult because it challenges things we knew before. Think Santa Claus. When our parents tell us there is in fact no Santa Claus, do we hold it against them for years to come, letting it create a slow rift in our relationships and distrust in everything they say? Well, hopefully not. We're better than that. Like Ivy, we trust our parents, and we often even pass on the story of Santa Claus to our children. Likewise, Ivy's immediate response wasn't doubt or anger. It was more faith. Faith that her father and the other elders had a good reason for the lie. And lastly, Ivy's faith had pure motives. She was always motivated by love. Her end goal was always in the right place. She wanted to save Lucius, and she would do anything to achieve that goal. Which brings us to our scene in the woods. Ivy has just been told that there are no monsters. They are not real. Awesome. Off we go into the woods. But then she encountered a monsters in the woods. What? I don't know about you, but everything about that scene seems terrifying. Ivy's blind, so she can't see. She's alone because her escorts abandoned her out of fear. And then there's a monster where there shouldn't be a monster because her father told her the monsters don't exist. Ivy went into the woods a little scared anyway. A lifetime of conditioning doesn't just wipe away with a few encouraging words. But she keeps going, despite her fear. She loves Lucius. She trusts her father that there is medicine in the towns that will save him. And then there is the monster in the woods. This is where I'd like to make the comparison to Peter. Ivy and Peter both have goals in mind motivated by love. Ivy loves Lucius and her father, and Peter loves the Savior. Motives are good. Check. Both exercise their faith by doing something that could be considered scary. Ivy goes into the woods alone, and Peter gets out of the boat to walk on water. Both encounter something additionally frightening during this exercise of faith. Ivy encounters a monster that shouldn't exist, and Peter is faced with a boisterous wind that he thinks threatens his safety. It is at this moment that they have a choice. This is where we're going to take a really close look. What happened in this moment? They were both doing fine, facing their fears, leaning into their faith and their end goals and motives, and then they had a choice. They were presented with a new fear. Quentin L. Cook, in his talk Live by Faith and Not by Fear, says that our faith in Jesus Christ sustains us at the crossroads of life's journey. I love that idea. Fear is a reaction that creates a crossroads. It creates a choice. The scriptures teach us that we should avoid fear completely. Our faith and our love of Christ should be so strong that we have no fear. I look at this counsel the same way I look at the declaration to be ye therefore perfect. It's the goal we should strive for, but we're human. So what do we as humans do in the meantime before we reach perfection? We do our best. In an ideal world, we would never come to the crossroads that fear creates because we would never be afraid. But we do. Fear is a part of our lives. Each of us have moments of fear, so we find ourselves at that crossroad where we have a choice. And what are the choices? Faith and doubt. Think of fear as an instinctual reaction to a stimulus. When we experience that reaction, we have control over the next step. We can choose faith or we can choose doubt. When we choose doubt, we let fear take the wheel. When we choose faith, we let Jesus take the wheel. It is for this reason that I think the relationship between fear and faith isn't quite as simple as opposites. Fear is incompatible with faith, certainly, like oil and water or Aries and Libra, but that doesn't make them true opposites. Doubt, I would argue, is the real opposite of faith. My reason for this goes back to the Savior's rebuke of Peter. O thou of little faith, wherefore didst thou doubt? Not wherefore didst thou fear? It was Peter's doubt that justified a chastisement, not his fear. This was his choice when presented with fear. He chose doubt. In contrast, when Ivy was presented with fear that would have sent me running back from whence I came, she doubled down in the motives that fueled her faith and kept moving forward. She faced the fear and chose faith. Now, to be clear, I am not in any way saying that Ivy is a better role model for faith than an apostle of the Lord. Do not mistake this comparison. Context of circumstance should be considered. But I do find Ivy's example slightly more attainable for myself based on where I am in my life right now. I'm not sure I would have anywhere near the faith necessary even to get out of the boat if my Savior stood in my presence and were beckoning me to come to him by walking on water. Peter is far more a spiritual giant than I may ever be. But I might have the faith to confront some of the monsters in my life and faithfully do the next right thing. Insert appropriate Frozen 2 reference here. And it's an interesting interpretation of our driving question, isn't it? What is the relationship between fear and faith? Based on these two examples, it seems that the presence of fear is what affords us the opportunity to practice our faith. How can we have faith that things will be better if there isn't some threat that they won't? Fear is a part of this life on earth. We're here to be tested. Fear is a part of that test. In the words of Gregory Clark, even with the knowledge of the truth, in the present moment of our day-to-day experience, we remain subject to fear. But after we encounter that fear, we have a choice. Imagine a cup of oil to which you start adding water. What happens? The water sinks because it's more dense, and the oil will eventually start to spill out over the top. For every additional drop of water you put in, another drop of oil is pushed out. This is the same relationship with fear and faith. The more you choose faith, the less fear there will be. Quentin L. Cook tells us that when we follow the counsel of the scriptures, our faith increases and our fears decrease. My interpretation of this is that realistically, you can still move forward without perfect faith. You can still move forward with some fear. I would be willing to bet that Ivy was still plenty afraid when she encountered that monster, but she let faith win. I'd like to imagine that Peter was still a little apprehensive when he was walking on the water towards Jesus, but it was only when he let the fear overpower his faith and chose doubt that he began to sink. Even though Jesus' initial invitation was to fear not, Jesus didn't chastise Peter for his fear. He chastised him for his doubt. At the intersection of fear, there are two choices: doubt and faith. Gregory Clark confirms this by saying that faith is a choice to believe and to act upon that belief in the face of uncertainty. And what is the result? My favorite answer to this question comes from a talk by David A. Bednar. He quotes Mosiah 23:28, which says that, "Therefore they hushed their fears." I realize that in an effort to be, therefore, perfect, we want to eradicate fear from our lives completely. But until we reach that perfection, we might only be able to hush the fear. Essentially, let it exist, but tell it to shut up and choose faith. Remember the cup of water and oil? Anytime we add water to the cup, we are choosing faith, even if there's still some fear sitting on top. Faith does not appear immediately out of nowhere. It grows over time. There's a whole chapter on faith in Alma 32 where instructions are given to experiment upon my words and exercise a particle of faith. No more than a desire to believe is enough to let faith work in you. Work implies a process. A long process. If fear is the crossroads we're bound to encounter on our journey multiple times, we should probably plan our route in advance. So, which way are you headed? I hope you enjoyed today's topic about fear and faith, using the village as a springboard for conversation and comparison. And while the movie is certainly in the world, hopefully looking at Ivy's faith through a gospel lens can help give us insight for how to avoid being of the world. Thank you for tuning in to the In the World podcast. I hope you join me next time as we find new entertainment and media to examine through a gospel lens.